So this lesson is over proving parallelograms, and it's the exact opposite of what we did earlier. Earlier I told you this is a parallelogram, so solve for x, and now I'm going to tell the opposite. How would you prove that these are parallelograms, or how would you know it's a parallelogram? So these are the 5 properties of a parallelogram that we've learned. First one, both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. I think that's like the definition of a parallelogram. Opposite sides parallel. Both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. Both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. Both of the diagonals bisect each other. So far all of them say both in them. One angle is supplementary to both of its consecutive angles. So all of them have that word both in there. We did that on purpose to make sure you realize that all of them are pairs. So what's the relationship between the following statements? So for this one, if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then it has opposite sides that are congruent. So that's what we learned before. If a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then the opposite sides are congruent. Now we're learning the opposite of that, the inverse of that. If a quadrilateral has opposite sides that are congruent, that means it is a parallelogram. So this is a biconditional, kind of like we talked about last semester. So again, these are going to look very similar to what we did in the last section, but they are a little bit different. Both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. So again, if we know both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, then that has to be parallelogram. So the next one, is that a parallelogram? Well, it is, because we know both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. The third one, is that a parallelogram? Yes, it is, because we know both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. What about this bottom left here? That is a parallelogram because one angle is supplementary to both consecutive angles. And I don't remember how I did it in the other video if you watched that. But to prove it's a parallelogram, it's got to be both of them. I know there's been times that I've changed this for the last lesson we did, and I said that any angle is supplementary to the consecutive angle, to the one next to it. But to prove it's a parallelogram, not only does it have to be the one beside it, but it's got to be the other consecutive one as well. It's got to be both of those. Next one, we know it's a parallelogram if the diagonals bisect each other. And the last one, this one's a little bit new. One pair of sides is both parallel and congruent. So if you look at A, B, and D, C, so this line and this line, they are congruent to each other. That's great, but they also are parallel. So if they're congruent to each other, that's almost this one, but not quite, because this has both pairs and this is only one pair. But since they're also parallel, that means that they work out. That means that is a parallelogram. So again, even that one has the word both in there. It's only one pair of opposite sides, but that one pair of opposite sides has to be both parallel and congruent. So we're just going to go through yes or no, is it a parallelogram, is it not, and why. So the first one is yes, it's a parallelogram, and it's because both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. Again, it's got to be both pairs. The next one is no, and the reason is because those two opposite sides are parallel, but they're not congruent, 1, 6, and 1, 5. So this one is no, the opposite sides are not congruent. The next one is yes, it is, because those diagonals do bisect each other. And the last one is most definitely no, and the reason is because those diagonals do not bisect each other. Next one, number 4, is yes, the opposite, both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. Number 5 is yes, and again, it's because if you take 95 plus 85, add these two together, that's supplementary, it adds up to 180. And if you take the 95 and this 85 and add those together, it's 180. And the next one is, so this is where it's a little bit confusing. So for me, I'm just going to say no, it's not a parallelogram. Technically, the answer would be you can't tell if it's a parallelogram or not, because one pair of opposite sides are congruent, but they don't say anything about these, or sorry, one pair of opposite angles are congruent. They don't say anything about these two angles. So maybe they're congruent, and it would be a parallelogram, but maybe not. So there's not enough information. So again, For my class, just go ahead and put no for that. That's completely fine. Technically, this one would be we cannot determine, whereas the other two we did. This one we know it's not a parallelogram because those are not congruent. This one we know it's not a parallelogram because these are not congruent. So those are most definitely not parallelograms, whereas this one, again, technically you could say, well, it could be, but we don't know enough information. But again, just put no. So if I made that confusing and made that complicated, I apologize. But I don't want to anger the math gods and not share that little piece of information. And last but not least, that one is yes, and it's because both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. So go ahead and do this one, do these on your own. So when I show you these, hit pause, go ahead and answer it, and then hit play so you can see the answer, double check your work. Kind of jumped the gun on that one. But yes, that is a parallelogram. Both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. The next one, the answer for this one, also yes. Diagonals both bisect each other. Number 3, again, if you can help it, try to pause it, answer this on your own, then check your answers. I'll try not to go too quickly so you have time to pause it. But this one is yes. Both opposite sides are parallel. Go ahead, pause it. This one is no. And again, not enough information. The other thing, if you answered this one and said, they don't tell us that AD is congruent to BC, or they don't mention that angle A and angle C are congruent, any of those explanations are also fine, but they don't give us enough information is also a fine answer. So for this one, go ahead and pause it quick. So this one is yes, the one pair of opposite sides is both parallel and congruent. And this one, go ahead, pause it. This one is no, the opposite, there's two ways to explain this one. So the way I would have noticed is that the opposite angles are not congruent. 60 is not congruent to 70, and 120 is not congruent to 110. That's one way to explain, but also some of you might have noticed that one angle is not supplementary to both of its consecutive angles. So 120 and 60 is 180, that's great, but 120 and 70 is not 180, that'd be 190. So either of those is fine. Go ahead, pause it. And for this one, the answer is no, and it's because, again, not enough information. And if you want to go ahead and be more detailed and say, we don't know that angle C and angle A are congruent, that's fine, but not enough information is totally sufficing. This one is yes, just like the one we did a little bit ago. Two ways to explain it. Both pairs of opposite angles are congruent, that's what I would have used, but also one angle is supplementary to both of the angles that are consecutive. So 120 and 60 is 180, that's great. And this 120 and this 60 is also 180. And again, any of them, you could do this 60 with this 120 and this 120. Doesn't matter which angle you start with. So this reference sheet, I'm not going to go into it in great detail. I'm not going to do this at all in the notes to save you guys a little bit of time. But also, this whole reference sheet is up on Canvas. And it's all filled out, so it's not blank like this. It actually has the diagonals drawn in. It has the congruent marks in there, the congruent arcs for angles, all that stuff. So if you have this and it's blank, go there and copy things down from there, because there's not much more I'm going to say that we didn't explain in the last couple lessons. And if you don't have one of those, pick one up for me sometime in class.